Hi, welcome back to my channel, and let's talk about some books that I finished reading recently. The first book that I would like to talk about is a book that I've already talked about a little bit in a reading vlog where I finished reading this book, and that is Shirley by Charlotte Brontë. This is Charlotte Bronte's, I think, second published novel. So the first one is Jane Eyre, which is her most popular, famous, that's the book of Charlotte Brontë that most people read. Like a lot of the Bronte's novels, Shirley is set in Yorkshire, which is where the Brontes were from, and this novel is set during the Napoleonic Wars. And during this time in Yorkshire, there was a lot of conflict between mill workers and mill owners, and the conflict was mainly about the fact that a lot of mill owners were thinking, if I just get a machine to do the job of these, 100 people, that would save me a lot of money. Obviously, the mill workers were not very pleased, and you see a lot of this conflict also in other areas of England, specifically sort of on the other side of the Pennines. And I think this was a really interesting backdrop for this novel. So there is a lot of unrest going on in the background, but our main characters are actually slightly removed from this conflict. So this novel is mainly about two women in this little rural place in Yorkshire, and one of them is sort of middle class but not particularly well off, and she's very dependent on her uncle. She's called Caroline, and she makes a new friend who is called Shirley, and Shirley is a rich heiress, and she owns some land, she's a landowner, she has a lot of businesses, stuff that she has to do, and she's quite powerful, and she doesn't have any parents or any sort of familial oversight, so there's no one really that tells her what to do. She can basically do whatever she wants. And the first half of this novel is basically about their relationship to each other, about their lives. Shirley actually isn't really introduced in the first 100 pages, which really threw me off. I was like, why is this called Shirley when there's no character called Shirley? But, in typical Victorian manner, Shirley does appear eventually. And, there's some romances for both of them, there's some intrigue, who's going to pair up with who, very exciting. And the backdrop of the sort of mill unrest is sort of woven into the story, and there's a beautiful set piece in the middle of the story where this all sort of culminates and comes together, and I was really on the edge of my seat at that point in the book. I was really excited. And then, for some reason, the second half of the book, it didn't work for me. I think maybe for some people it would, but to me it felt like the quality of the writing and just the quality of the storytelling in particular. I think the writing on a sentence level was still really nice, but the storytelling, for me, it went completely off the rails. It just didn't really feel like the stories came together in a meaningful way. And I do know that during the time that Charlotte Brontë was writing this book, sadly, her two sisters, so Anne and Emily, as well as her older brother, Branwell, they all passed in really rapid succession, and that really influenced and affected her writing of this novel particularly. And I really wonder whether the parts that I don't get on with and the parts that I think just aren't quite on the same level are actually because she was dealing with really intense grief, and obviously that has changed her worldview, and that possibly the latter half of the book just didn't really suit the first half of the book because the author had changed. Just the way that she treats the characters, it really feels like that has changed in the latter half of the book. So for example, the two female main characters, Caroline and Shirley, barely interact in the second half, even though they are in physical proximity. For some reason, they're just, their friendship seems to have just dissolved, even though we're so close in the first half of the book. The romantic storylines just they resolve, but not in a very interesting way. I personally have some feelings about the man that Shirley ends up with, and you can see me reading some quotes in that vlog that I've mentioned and that I will link below, etc. But it almost feels like Charlotte Brontë had written this really fun, powerful character, and then by the end of it was like, wait a second, we can't have this character be so powerful and be so really convinced of her own place and her own authority, all of that. She was like, you know what? Nope. Shirley does not deserve any of that, and, she's just going to be a nice housewife from now on. Reading between the lines in Shirley, I think there are so many really interesting, almost conflicting elements to it. So on one hand, one of the things that is quite clear in the beginning of the book is that Caroline is very limited in what she can do because her uncle is basically like, well, you're a woman, you're useless, just sit around and sew something or whatever. Obviously, Caroline is immensely bored by this, and she doesn't really have much to do except for her womanly occupations. And she does really want to feel useful, and a part of this novel is therefore about middle-class women in this period of time, which is the first half of the 19th century, and how limited their options could be, whereas Shirley, you know, who is rich, she has so many more options. So a lot of the first half of this book is about middle-class women just wanting something to do, basically. Obviously, this issue doesn't really apply to working-class women because working-class women had to work, so they wouldn't really be, you know, bored with time on their hands. On the other hand, there's something really regressive, repressive, however you want to call it, about how the romances are resolved. Charlotte Bronte's conception of relationships, romantic relationships, and sort of the family is actually extremely patriarchal. So there's this really weird dichotomy of the husband is going to be my teacher, he's going to tell me what's what, and I will have no opinion whatsoever on anything because he's there to guide me. But at the same time, there is also like, oh, but we should have more space in society at large. So my experience with this book was just mixed. I think some passages were absolutely brilliant. I think the writing on a sentence level is beautiful, and I just love the way the narrator is presenting this story. It's all just really, really well done. But I do think it kind of falls apart in the second half. So, you know, a mixed bag. Another book that I finished is Romance of the Forest by Anne Radcliffe, and this book was published in 1791. Anne Radcliffe was a really popular author of Gothic romances at the end of the 18th century, so I think she published 5 in her lifetime. And for some, honestly, it's just a coincidence. I've been reading them in publication order, so this is the 3rd novel she published. It's also the 3rd book by Anne Radcliffe that I have read. Radcliffe was one of the authors that really popularized some of the Gothic tropes that we associate with the Gothic genre. So there's often like castles with skeletons, hidden trapdoors, and found manuscripts that sort of end just at the point where you found out what this was all about. And there's always a Gothic heroine who's being pursued by some gross man who wants to marry her for some reason because she's so beautiful and he must have her, and she doesn't want him, she wants this other guy who is very virtuous and wonderful. And I feel like Romance of the Forest is probably the first book by Radcliffe that I read where I feel like all of those Gothic elements have finally really gelled together. This is the book where I feel like Radcliffe is really coming into her powers, because in the first 2 of her novels you can just tell that her writing, I wouldn't call it amateurish because I feel like that it sounds way too harsh and isn't really the issue, but I feel like she really finds her voice and she really finds a way of storytelling that really works for this kind of story in this novel. Romance of the Forest starts with in mysterious circumstances. A couple is fleeing from Paris because, you know, their creditors are coming for them and they cannot pay them back. So they are fleeing and they are they become embroiled in this thing where there is this beautiful young woman that is basically just thrown into the hands, and they're told, you take care of her or you're going to die. So they flee with the beautiful young woman called Adeline, and throughout the story there's going to be, of course, a lecherous man who wants to pursue Adeline, and they all end up in this chateau where there is a skeleton holding a manuscript and creepy things are happening. Radcliffe is really good at suspense, so it's not really a scary book. I wouldn't say that this type of Gothic is about fear or is about being scared or terrified. It's very much about wanting to know, like, why is all of this happening? There are always a lot of mysterious circumstances and hidden paternities and stuff like that that have to be uncovered. And that is sort of what drives this novel forward, not knowing what the heck is going on. I quite enjoyed Romance of the Forest. I think this is just good, solid, Gothic fun. I got sort of quagmired in the middle of the book. I felt like there were some spots that were perhaps a little bit slow, but ultimately I was really happy to finish reading this, find out what the hell was going on, and it was just fun. Then I've also finished reading a couple of short books because there's this event that's currently being hosted on YouTube, and I will put the hosts links and stuff down below. That is called Shorty September, during which a lot of people read short books and just have a good time. One of the short books that I have finished reading is Briefe, einen junge Dichter by Rilke. In English, this book is translated as Letters to a Young Poet, and I've already read this book in English only a couple of months ago. I think I read it in March or May, something around that time. And this is a collection of letters written by Rilke, who was a German language poet, and he is responding to letters from an aspiring poet that, you know, asked him for advice and asked him, you know, is my poetry good? What should I do? I feel really lonely. There's no one who can help me with my art. You know, give me some advice. And this was an exchange of letters that lasted a couple of years, or spanned a couple of years. I think it started in 1902, and I thought it lasted till 1908, but I'm not 100% sure about that now. And this is a really short book. There's only 10 letters in here, and the letters aren't super long either. But I think one of the reasons that people still read these letters, and there are a lot of people who really feel inspired, really feel perhaps consoled by these letters, is because Rilke writes with such kindness and with such feeling and so accepting. He's so immensely nice in these letters to this poet that I think, for me, as well as a lot of other people who really like this book, it just provides so much support. And the way Rilke talks about, he talks a lot about solitude, because the poet that he is conversing with has recently been sent to this sort of outpost, this military outpost where there are basically no people, and he's just, you know, doing his military thing, but is just really, really lonely. So Rilke talks a lot about loneliness, but in such a understanding and wonderful way that it sort of feels like he becomes like a companion in loneliness. And the way he talks about art, and one of the things that I really appreciate about it is that, you know, this poet Koppes was asking, oh, is my art any good? And Rilke is like, don't ask me, ask yourself. If you think your art is good, go into yourself, ask yourself if your art is good. And if it sort of comes from a true place, then your art is the best it can be. And I think there's something really wonderful about that, and it's something that I sometimes think back on when I'm doing my own art, when I do my own writing. And I think about Rilke being like, no, you need to be happy with what you're writing. And I think like, thank you, Rilke. I really needed that pep talk sometimes. I think Letters to a Young Poet is just a wonderful little book. There are so many beautiful quotes, there are so many beautiful passages that I really liked revisiting, even though I've already read it once this year, but it was still just as wonderful the second time. And I also really enjoyed being able to experience it in the original language. So I did read this in German. It was one of the first books I've read in German ever, I would say, but it went really well, and I'm so pleased, and I'm really happy that I got to read this in the way it was originally written, without sort of having the additional filter of translation sort of morphing the words. Another book that I read was Quicksand by Nella Larsen, and this was really, really wonderful and a really good read. It was also quite short, which is also really lovely, but I did an entire review for this book, as well as for Nella Larsen's other book, which is called Passing. So I will just direct you to that video, because I feel like I've already spoken about this book at length. Finally, I've also finished reading Siddhartha by Herman Hesse, and this was another German book. You know, I've started reading German books now I just need to read all of the German books. Siddhartha was published in 1922, but initially it didn't really get a lot of attention in the English-speaking world. Apparently it got a lot more popular in the 1960s, especially in the United States. I'm not really surprised by that, because the 1960s were characterized by a sort of increase in new agey thought, and I can really see how this kind of book would be really interesting for people who are really into new agey sort of things, who are interested in Eastern philosophy through a Western lens. The main character, Siddhartha, is living in ancient India and he is seeking. He is looking for enlightenment and he seeks enlightenment through various means. So this is a novel about him growing up, about him traveling around, about him engaging with various philosophies and trying to find basically the answer to everything, the universe, and how to live. So initially he seeks enlightenment through learning. When that doesn't yield the answer, he also seeks enlightenment through sort of just completely removing himself from the senses. Then he goes completely the other direction, he goes full into hedonism, and he tries all of these various things, and all of these various experiences culminate eventually into him finding a form of enlightenment. In terms of the type of book that this is very much a book about spiritual matters. It is very much about finding meaning in life and how do we create meaning, etc. I have to admit, I'm not a hugely spiritual person at all. I'm also not religious, so a lot of these themes just don't really connect with me, and I think that's very important to know because it definitely colors the way that I see this book. I mainly see it as a literary artifact, whereas I think for a lot of people, reading Siddhartha is probably a much more emotional experience and a much more spiritual experience than it is for me. The book has a really simple, lyrical, sort of flowing writing style, which I really enjoyed. It uses a form of repetition, but I think in terms of the type of book that this felt really appropriate, and I really liked the way it uses phrases that return over and over, and I think in terms of the larger message of the book, I think that worked really well. From a practical perspective, I also just really appreciated it because my German is alright, but it's not amazing, so the fact that the language used was relatively accessible, I really enjoyed that. I was just about to tell you how my reading experience of Siddhartha kind of reminded me, now kind of, just very slightly reminded me of reading The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. And that's mainly just because they both have this sort of flavor of wanting to teach you something about life, wanting to penetrate into the meaning of life, that sort of thing. Now, I did not get on with The Alchemist whatsoever. I did not like that book. On the other hand, I found Siddhartha to be quite interesting, and although I didn't necessarily connect with some of the experiences that Siddhartha goes through and some of the dialogues that he's having, and sometimes it almost felt like sort of Socratic dialogue where, you know, he's only using the dialogue to expose his philosophical thoughts, and it was very much not about the other character or actually developing any of the other characters. In terms of characterization, I think this book is actually relatively flat because it's just using archetypes. However, one of the things that I did find interesting about it and that did make me think a bit was about the difference between wisdom and knowledge, and that we can pass on knowledge to the next generations and other people, but that we can't pass down wisdom, and that there's a limit to what we can teach other people. And in the book, it's mainly about knowledge passing down from father to son, basically. But I think this applies to just humanity in general. You know, there's this part of human experience that your parents are like, don't do this thing! And then every single generation of children does the thing. Because there are just parts of human experience that you just need to try and experience. And I found that a really interesting concept, and it really made me think about how certain mistakes are just repeated throughout history. That's something I think about a lot, about how a lot of things in history are cyclical and how we often don't really learn the lessons from the past. And that really fits together with this idea that there are parts of knowledge, parts of wisdom that cannot be passed on to another person through learning, through telling them, through any sort of medium to let them know to not do it, that there are some things that just need to be experienced. I think Siddhartha is a great book for people who have an interest in Eastern philosophy, particularly Buddhism. Buddha is actually a character in this book, which I thought was quite interesting. So if you're one of those people who finds that really compelling, I actually think Siddhartha is a great book. So those are the books that I have finished reading recently. I hope you're having a lovely reading month. I hope you're doing well. And I also hope to see you again perhaps sometime soon in another video. Thank you for watching. Bye.